everyone, Sakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And welcome back to the podcast, my hoes. Welcome back to the final part. I know, it's supposed to be 2 parts. I understand that. I did a whole thing with a multi-part thing here again. It's the end of Ibn Battuta, my friends. It's the end of the grand old journey, which, I mean, honestly, what should I have really expected? The fact that it was the greatest Muslim explorer to ever exist. And I try to cram his entire story with all of his adventures into the span of like a single episode or 2.
Yeah, that was a bad call.
Yeah, it was probably a bad call.
This highly ambitious.
It was, because this is a thing that takes place over the course of 29 years. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of everything that happens in it.
But before we launch into that, we only have 3 more spots left, like the early bird spots, with the $200 discount left for the trip to Germany and Austria this Christmas for the Christmas markets. And in addition, we will be going to a LARP event called The Reckoning in Kentucky. It is May 24th to 28th, and we're going to be part of the Hadrian Empire. If you guys are interested, make sure to check it out. Like, check out the Reckoning LARP website and check out their Discord. There's also a Hadrian Empire Discord if you guys have any questions with prep, or if you just want to find out about the event.
If there is anyone out there who has ever wanted to fight me about a subject, you can fight me now in real life.
Or fight with him. It's up to you. But I'm super excited because I'm going to be an archer, and I would love to see you guys there.
Yes.
Now on to Ibn Battuta.
Ibn Battuta. To finish Ibn Battuta. Do you remember where it was that we were last time here, Gabby? Because I know it's been like a week and a half since we actually did the previous thing here. So the previous, where we had left off, for anyone who is probably people who are listening to this are probably listening to the previous episode and then immediately jumping into this. So where it is that we had left off, Ibn Battuta had just finally made it to his destination, the place that he had wanted to go since the very beginning, to India, to the Delhi Sultanate, only to get the ever-loving crap scared out of him by the ruler there, who, like Muhammad Tughlaq, who was regarded as a amazing, wonderful psychopath. Which is arguably a way that you could describe many different rulers throughout history. But this guy definitely, if the stories are to be believed about him, probably takes the cake, and he wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. So Ibn Battuta was tasked with going to China to lead the Sultan's delegation that was specifically going to be going there. So in 1341, Ibn Battuta sets out from Delhi at the head of a group that is bound for China. Gifts from Muhammad Tughlaq to the Mongol emperor included 200 Hindu slaves, singers and dancers, 15 pages, 100 horses, and great amounts of cloth, dishes, and swords. There were around 1,000 soldiers that were under his command to protect the treasure and supplies until they could board their ships to China, and it was supposed to be a grand old journey.
I feel like gifting swords as one ruler to the other would be a little stressful. You could possibly be gifting your future enemies. Like if the US was like, hey, as my gift to you, I'm going to gift you all of these tanks or aircraft carriers.
That is a great point until you remember that the weapons that they're usually giving are not for use in war. They're like super fancy ones. They're the ones that are all gilded and like decorative and all the. It's like the fancy stuff that you would give as a gift for someone, for like an officer to wear on their side to show off how pretty and important they are.
So it's like if we gifted a gold-plated tank. Pretty.
Yes.
Useless.
Yeah, it doesn't actually have composite armor on it. No, instead that whole thing is actual gold.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, actually.
And it's like so soft that someone could walk up and hit it and it just bends.
Actually, if anybody wants to gift me a gold tank, I'm just saying, I'll send you my address. DM me.
Oh my God. Some Arabic sheik is going to hear this and just like try to ship over a tank, which we live in the United States, so therefore we could actually get one.
You think people are listening to this? Important people are listening to this podcast?
Okay, fair enough.
Like you think an Arabic sheik is on here like, yes, let me hear what he has to say about Ibn Battuta.
I don't know. There are some events, like I really wish that I could have been on that one plane that one Saudi Arabian prince was on, where every single seat in the plane was booked for his birds. Because remember, there was that one guy who all of his hunting falcons, each and every single one got a seat for for a bird.
Which is the smart thing to do if you care about your pets. I would totally book a plane for Booker if I had money like that.
Yeah. And in this case, the procession that they're leading in here might as well be that too. But a few days outside of Delhi, the group gets attacked by around 4,000 Hindu rebels. Remember, Muhammad Tughlaq was not exactly a popular ruler among his Hindu countrymen. Although vastly outnumbered, Ibn Battuta would claim that they defeated the rebels easily. And later, there was another attack, and Ibn Battuta gets separated from his companions. Suddenly, a force of Hindus would jump out of the woods. 10 horsemen would reportedly chase him at full gallop across the fields, but he was able to outride 3 of them and then hide from the rest in a deep ditch. After escaping, he was again confronted, and this time by 40 Hindus, he said, who would rob him of everything except his shirt, pants, and cloak. Some of the robbers would keep their prisoner in a cave overnight, and they planned his death in the morning. So they were going to kill him. Fortunately, though, Ibn Battuta, who apparently at this point had nothing to rob because they stole literally everything from him, he was able to convince his captors to let him go in exchange for his clothes that he still had on him.
This guy, every time he travels somewhere, something insane happens to him.
Yep.
You remember the dysentery from like 2 episodes ago?
Yep, that is what happens to him. And so this guy, now naked, right? He manages to leave, exhausted, barefooted, and wearing nothing but his trousers. 8 days later, Ibn Battuta gets rescued by a Muslim who carries him to a village. And 2 days later, he finds his party and rejoins it, and was then ready to proceed on his original mission to go to China.
It's so nice to let him keep his trousers.
Yeah, just you got to keep the respectability up there from little Ibn Battuta to make sure that he's not revealed. The group then continues to Daladabad without further trouble, and after a few days' rest, they would go and continue to the coastal city of Cambay. Within days, the group was at Gandhar, where they would board 4 ships. 3 were large dhows that were meant to carry the gifts, including 100 horses and 215 slaves and pages, and the 4th was a warship, which was supposed to carry soldiers to defend them against attacks from pirates. Because remember, at this point, at this place, there are pirates literally everywhere across the ocean.
How did people arrange for travel? Like, I know he's traveling for the king of Delhi, right? The leader.
Yes.
So did he send messengers ahead of time saying, hey, I need these 4 ships?
You send messengers, you send letters, and you also, more important than any of that, you send massive amounts of money. Because the money that they're being sent with is not just stuff as gifts, but things that can be used to barter away in order to, whether it's bribes, whether it's just to get passage, whether it's literally anything like that.
I'm assuming they contracted the ships, right? So they're like, hey, you have a ship, I have people.
Yes.
And you have a warship, I have people.
Yes.
That's kind of cool, actually.
Yes, and that's what they would do. Everything had to be kind of arranged on the fly, unless you were at a situation where the ships were already waiting for them to go. But in many cases, you have to actually pay for your travel in order to be able to get to a certain place.
Yeah, I'm guessing there was no hertz for ships.
No, there wasn't. They wouldn't have had any kind of taxi services. It was typically merchants or military vessels or the private vessels of governors that could be bought or given for friends or whatever. They would be able to utilize something. So using the monsoon winds to propel them, the 4 ships would head south and would arrive at the port of Calcutta. There they would be received with drums, trumpets, horns, and flags. And as he would say, we entered the harbor amid great ovation and pomp, the likes of which I have not seen in these parts. In the same harbor were 13 Chinese junks, which were massive ships. For anyone who hasn't seen anything for like the historical Chinese junks, oh my God, these things were the original super barges of the day, probably much like the Song era ship that is shown in some of the drawings. If you go and actually look at them, I promise you, Gabby, right now, look up Chinese junk. Look it up. Look it up. I should have put this in here. There's a whole thing that I had this from that I should have put it in. It was huge. Like, dude, I know what to do. For anyone who is listening to this right now, go and Google Chinese junk versus Christopher Columbus ship. Because these things existed at the same time. Do you see what I'm talking about?
And they're pretty.
Oh, they are very colorful. These things would hold quite literally thousands of men on them. They were much larger than the dhows, some with 5 decks and 5 masts. Remember that on a lot of the ships, the big European warships, those things typically had up to 3 masts when they were the big ones with the center main, and these things had 5. They had interior cabins and even private lavatories, like private bathrooms. The crew of a junk might be up to 1,000 workers, which is a lot. Ibn Battuta did note that they weren't as safe as the Dhow when traveling close to the shore, which would make sense considering that they were freaking massive. And it would be on 3 of these large ships that they were supposed to continue to China. So the crew transferred the gifts, including the horses and slaves, to the junks, and Ibn Battuta would spend the day in the mosque and plan to board the ship that afternoon. But
There's always a but.
and every single time he is traveling to a place, do you know what happens?
Something terrible.
Something freaking terrible.
As if being robbed weren't terrible enough. I guess there's more.
Yeah. A violent storm broke out. And because the harbor was not very deep, remember, these junks are massive vessels, the captains of the junks ordered the ships to wait out the storm in deeper water out to sea. Ibn Battuta would wait helplessly on the beach all night, and the next morning, he watched in horror as 2 of the ships were pushed onto the shore, breaking apart and sinking. Some of the crew of one of the junks was saved, but no one survived the other ship, the one that he was actually supposed to be on. So he could have died right there.
A good thing he decided to pray all afternoon.
Yeah. As he would say, quote, "The slaves, pages, and horses were all drowned, and the precious wares either sunk or washed up on the beach, where the governor's soldiers struggled to prevent the townsfolk from making off with the loot." Like literally, you have to think about it. You have all these poor people that have never seen anything so fine in their life, and you have a actual embassy, delegation, like all of this really rich stuff crashes and it just washes ashore. This is the equivalent of if, like, imagine if an armored truck that, goes to banks and whatnot flipped over on the street and exploded, setting money everywhere. That is what happened in this scenario. The other ship carried Ibn Battuta's luggage, his servants, and slave girls, one of which was actually pregnant with his child. The captain of that ship had set sail for China without him or the goods that was supposed to be a present for the Emperor of China, and he was just left behind. Ibn Battuta, now alone, penniless, and ashamed, because at this point he was a failure as the leader for the trip to China for the Sultan of Delhi, but he was still lucky to be alive.
How many children did he have?
I think that it was like 7 in total by the end of this.
So he was just knocking people up and never seen them again?
Oh, yeah. There's actually a case we're going to be getting into later in this episode where he gets married to like 3 different women and then divorces all of them.
Real stand-up guy.
Yeah. Though, to be fair, it sounds like something that is really bad, which it kind of is, but there is a point to be made. In Islam, so you're not supposed to be having relations outside of marriage in many cases, but prostitution is still a thing in many places. So what they would do, and here's really interesting, Gabby, is they would set up something that would be a, get this, temporary marriage.
Oh, that's smart, actually.
So imagine a sailor comes to shore, gets married for a month, think of it like getting hitched in Vegas or something like that. And then when they're leaving, they get a divorce. Okay. Therefore, the relations they had during that time were totally legal in the eyes of, God and everything else.
And the women were okay with the temporary marriages?
Yeah, that's because they were basically prostitutes for that.
Really?
Yeah.
So they were prostitutes to get married temporarily?
Yes.
Interesting. I mean, yeah.
It's a very interesting legal and religious loophole system, the way that would work. But yeah, that is something that would actually happen.
But what about pregnancies?
Yeah, well, you don't know. Anything can happen. It's different for every place. It's different for every place. It was. So again, he was lucky to be alive, even though the whole thing seemed to be going up in flames around him. But still, there was a chance that he could catch up with that one other ship. So he tried to go and track it down. After 10 days, he arrived in another port and he waited for the ship, which ultimately never turned up. And about 3 months later, he would eventually learn that it had reached Indonesia and was seized by an infidel king of Sumatra, meaning in this case, it was one of the local animistic rulers or Hindu rulers. The slave woman who was carrying Ibn Battuta's child had died, as he would learn. And his other slaves and his other possessions were taken by this king of Sumatra. Man could not catch a break. He lost basically everything. So where was he to go? Was he supposed to return to the Sultan of Delhi? He wanted to do this. He wanted to go back to Muhammad Tughlaq, but he was afraid. This guy was a psychopath, remember? And he was afraid that if he went back as a failure, that it didn't matter if he was a friend of the Sultan. He was going to be executed for this. He decided that instead, okay, no, it is going to be safer to find another Muslim Sultan that we can serve in southern India to gain that person's favor with this Sultan. And, well, from there, hopefully it is that he'll be able to turn things around and make a name for himself. And he actually does. Because to gain favor with this other Sultan, he ends up joining in a battle.
Oh my gosh. What does this guy not do?
I know, right? This is like the story of everything. He does everything.
Okay, but these are just stories that he may have embellished, right?
Yeah, or the writer who is writing after him is saying, because remember, he didn't write any notes down during this entire time. All of the knowledge that we have of these stories comes after 29 years of travel, and we're going to get to this at the very end. He gets ordered to tell his story to a scholar, who that scholar then writes down his story and embellishes it with his own writings, his own knowledge, and also there's a very common thing that happens in Islamic storytelling, and that is that they combine accounts with other people.
Interesting.
So if they go to a city and they don't have a description of that city, they'll just take the description that was written down by another guy and just add it.
That's smart. But what I was going to say is it's starting to read a lot like a video game.
Yeah.
I guess, yes, the ship has sank. Well, let's see what else there is to do. And you just walk over and you join a battle.
You are right. It does sound like an RPG. It sounds like a Japanese RPG, but it's in real life.
Like one of those you'd buy at a convention and play it once and be like, okay, that was a wild ride.
And every single time you succeed, you finish the end of the game, you're super rich and wealthy and everything is awesome. And then you start the sequel and somehow magically something in the sequel causes you to lose all of your wealth and start over from the very beginning.
Pretty much, yeah.
That is you are right. That is kind of how it plays out. That is exactly how it plays out. Okay, so he joins in this battle, right? But when the next battle seemed to be an inevitable defeat, Ibn Battuta somehow manages to escape through the battle lines, and he heads down the coast, reaching Calcutta for the 5th time. There, he decides to continue on to China on his own. So not part of an expedition, not part of anything else, he's just going to go on his own. And he knows that he can get hospitality from fellow Muslims along the way, and that at least that will be okay. So he decides to continue on to China on his own, but again, he chooses to take the long way. Because it's Ibn Battuta. He's going to explore. He's going to do what he wants. This time to make a brief tour of the Maldives Islands, then continue to Sri Lanka and make a pilgrimage to the sacred Adam's Peak. And after that, he would go on to China. See, Ibn Battuta had not planned to spend much time here as he arrived in the capital, Male. But the rulers happened to be looking for a chief judge. Remember, we actually just did the episode for the patron exclusive episode on Mansa Musa and how they were very eager to get all these scholars. This is the same kind of concept. They need to recruit outside experts and help in order to be able to develop things for their Arabic and Sharia law. So the rulers were delighted to find a visitor that actually fit their requirements. They sent Ibn Battuta slave girls, pearls, gold jewelry, all to convince him to try and stay. They even made it impossible for him to arrange to leave by ship. So like it or not, the guy had to stay. He then agreed to remain there with some conditions. He would not go about Male on foot. He had to be carried in a litter or ride on horseback, just like the king or queen. He even would take another wife after staying there less than 2 months, a noblewoman who was related to the queen. It seemed at this point that Ibn Battuta was not just playing local politics, he was setting himself up as an actual kingmaker, as an actual power play.
And, gotta get a wife just for the time being.
Just for the time being, just to pass things along.
Honestly, that kind of sounds fun because you're committed, but you're not really committed.
Yeah.
It's perfect for people with commitment issues like me.
Sure. So he was now a member of the royal family and the most important judge in the nation. Really big deal. He set about his duties as a judge with enthusiasm, and he tried with all of his might to establish the rule of strict Muslim law and change local customs to accommodate that. remember how we've described a lot of this in places that he goes, is that he is a Muslim scholar and judge first and foremost. So every single thing that he does, he sees through the lens of that. He's quite judgmental, which he's a judge. That's literally his job. It's what he does.
Sounds like he's great at the requirements for his job.
So he puts in some strict practices. Like as an example, he orders that any man who fails to attend Friday prayer was to be whipped and publicly disgraced. Thieves would have their right hands cut off, and he ordered women who went topless to cover up. Like, because they weren't covering themselves up. Quote, I strove to put an end to this practice and command the women to wear clothes, but I could not get it done.
Has he tried wearing clothes? Not fun.
Yeah. While he was there, he would manage to take 3 more wives who also had powerful social connections.
Wait, so he's up to wife number 4?
Yes.
So he had 1, and then he had 3 more.
Yes.
So we have 4 total.
Yes.
Wow. Also, how did the people respond to him putting all of these rules in place?
Some would ignore him. Some would go along with it. It really just depends, right? Because the thing is, you can't, even as a powerful judge, you can't change everything. People are still going to do what it is that they're going to do, and he doesn't have nearly as much power and influence as he thinks that he should have.
Makes sense.
I guess that's the best way that I could phrase it. So yeah, he takes 3 more wives, all of which have powerful social connections, and afterwards seems to brag, quote, after I had become connected by marriage, the governor and the people feared me, for they felt themselves to be weak.
Okay, so he's full of himself.
He's getting really full of himself. And as you can imagine, because remember, he's being very harsh in all of his judgment, he is making a decent amount of enemies, especially the governor. And after a number of nasty arguments and political plots, Ibn Battuta decides, okay, I can't really do much here. I'm going to go ahead and leave. And this is after 9 months on the island. He quits his job as the Qadi. And although he really would have been fired if he had stayed longer, he just goes and leaves anyway. And he takes 3 of his wives with him.
What happened to the 4th?
She's left behind. But he divorces all of them after a short time.
He just left a wife behind?
Yeah, mind you, one of these was pregnant with his child. And he stays on another island, and there he marries 2 more women, and then he divorces them too.
Oh, wait, what?
Yes.
What is, because remember when he was in Delhi, he had a wife as well, and I think a daughter. So he had that wife, and then the second wife, the slave girl.
Well, the one from Delhi was a slave girl.
Well, no, that was the one from Delhi, but he also
he did marry another, yeah.
Yeah, he had a marriage in Delhi. Then he had the slave girl. Then he got married this lady. Then he married 3 after that. Then he married 2 more. Okay, I can't keep track.
So, in other words, this isn't just a JRPG. This is a harem JRPG. This is one of those animes.
Because that's a lot of wives, a lot of children. Because what happened to the wife in Delhi?
Left behind.
With the kid. He had a daughter.
So
I think it was a daughter.
Yeah. Here's the thing. It's a little bit complex, but this is how he would describe it. And so I took the quote directly from here that explains what it is that he says about marriage in the Maldives. He says, quote, it is easy to marry
Maldives?
in the Maldives.
Did
Yeah,
you
sorry.
just
I
say
said
Maldives?
The Maldives. Okay. It's easy to marry in these islands because of the smallness of the dowries and the pleasures of society which the women offer. When the ships put in, the crew marry. When they intend to leave, they divorce their wives. This is a kind of temporary marriage. The women of these islands never leave their country.
So they just stay there and continuously get married to new men?
Yes.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah, and it's kind of the way that it would be set up. So again, the temporary marriages, that it's how things would work for sailors, so that in the eyes of the law, their relations are not illegal.
I get that, as you explained before.
Yes.
But imagine being the woman who has to marry all of these sailors.
Hey, when you travel to many ports, you gotta lay down anchor, laddie.
Anchor? Oh my gosh. Boo. Boo.
I'm sorry, I had to. So Ibn Battuta goes and visits Sri Lanka on his way to China so that he could go on a pilgrimage to a holy site there, Adam's Peak, which this is a very curious thing. This is a peak that is sacred actually to 4 different faiths. I mean, 3 primarily. The Christians also look upon it, but 3 major faiths. Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism all regard this exact same rock as something that is sacred. And if you want to curious, for anyone who's wondering about this, this is a fascinating little thing. I swear the amount of conspiracy theorists on TikTok that go and talk about this place and say, oh, it's proof that giants were real. Go look it up right now. Go look up Adam's Peak and you'll see what it is that I mean. It basically looks like a gigantic footprint. So if you look at this thing, this is something that was sacred to Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. For near the summit, there is a depression on the rock that looks like a huge footprint. For Buddhists, it was the footprint of the Buddha. For Hindus, it was the print of Shiva. And for Muslims, it was the footprint of Adam, the first man and the first prophet, who pilgrims believed had been thrown there by God from the 7th heaven. There he stayed for 1,000 years before meeting Eve, the first woman. And it's a genuinely very curious thing. I find it fascinating how the exact same site could be a religious, not monument, that's not the right word.
Site?
It's a religious site for 3 very different faiths. That is fascinating to me. So when Ibn Battuta then arrives at Ceylon, he meets with the king. The king is interested in his travel stories, and he entertains Ibn Battuta's party for 3 days. And from there, the king would give him permission to climb Adam's Peak, and he would give Ibn Battuta a small purse with pearls and rubies, along with 2 slave girls, and supplies as a parting gift. After their visit to Adam's Peak, the party would return to the coast and would board another ship, which was provided by the king. And after setting sail, again, a storm would threaten their lives. The crew would manage to cut down the mast so that they wouldn't just be completely toppled, and they would make a crude raft which they would lower into the sea. Ibn Battuta's 2 companions and his slave girls would get down onto it, but there was no room left for him. And besides, he wasn't a strong swimmer. He had to stay with the ship and hope for the best. So as darkness fell and Ibn Battuta huddled in front of the sinking ship throughout the night, in the morning, a rescue party would suddenly appear and the remaining passengers were all taken to shore, and there he was able to join his companions. So once again, this guy seems to narrowly escape death. He had been able to save some of his belongings from the ship, including some pearls and rubies that were given to him, but his luck continued to be bad.
What is going on?
Yeah. Once he made it onto another small ship, 12 pirate ships went and attacked it. They quickly overpowered the crew, they stripped the passengers of everything that they owned, and, quote, they seized the jewels and rubies that the king of Ceylon had given me and robbed me of my clothes and provisions, which holy men and saints had favored me. They left nothing on my body except my trousers.
See, I'm so glad everyone he ran into left him with his trousers. That's just so gentlemanly.
Yep. The pirates then just went and dropped them all off on an island, or not an island, but on a nearby shore, completely unharmed. Took everything, but they left them. The humiliated group then had to make their way back to Calcutta with the clothes that had been still given to him, like that they still had. Ibn Battuta would then board another ship to Male, where his former home in the Maldive Islands, where he would stay for another 5 days. Here, he was actually able to see his son for the first time, and he agreed to leave him with his mother in the islands. From there, he got on a Chinese junk and would continue on his trip to China.
He's still not in China.
No, he has gone in circles like 3 freaking times at this point.
But he got to stop back and see his kids, so that's a win.
Yup. So from India, Ibn Battuta and some traveling companions would sail to Chittagong, now the chief port of Bangladesh, a Muslim country which is next to India. He would tell us that Chittagong was a city that was filled with food, but it smelled bad, that it was, quote, a hell crammed with good things. Everything there was cheap, including slaves. So he would buy, quote, an extremely beautiful slave girl for himself, and his friend would buy a young slave boy for a couple of gold dinar.
So they just had to. Why did they buy slaves? They didn't do things themselves?
Slaves for pleasure, slaves for help, slaves for everything. Here's the thing that a lot of people don't necessarily realize when they're looking at stuff in history and they don't understand the prevalence of the slave trade that existed at this time. A lot of people think about the slave trade as just like, oh, out of Africa going into the Americas. The slave trade was way bigger than that. And the Islamic trade networks that worked their way all across from Africa, going across the Mediterranean, going into the Indian Ocean, all the way into the Pacific Ocean was massive. It was massive. And this is where you would get trade goods from effectively anywhere and everywhere. And this region was something that was always under constant threat. Remember when they were traveling up into the steppe territory with all of the nomads?
Yeah.
Well, when you're in a place that has a lot of pillaging and burning as a cultural trait, this means that there's going to be a lot of displaced peoples that are easily able to be enslaved. So you have a lot of these different groups that end up filling up the markets, so to speak. But yeah, that's what happened.
Well, my friends, before we get back into today's episode, I would like to thank today's sponsor, Factor. For anyone who doesn't know what Factor is, it is something that has probably saved my life. As you can probably see, I'm standing here in a kitchen that is not exactly complete. Ignore that. We had a flood in the house and it completely destroyed everything, which meant that for the past 2 months, I haven't had a kitchen. Luckily, with Factor Never Frozen Meals, this means that I didn't have to actually worry about it, nor make myself sick for 2 months eating just fast food. This means I could get fresh, never frozen meals that were absolutely delicious, whether it was keto, calorie smart, vegan, whatever it is I want, I have it. I mean, the stuff literally takes 2 minutes. Just pierce the film in it, go ahead and throw it in. Dinner. Peel back the film and enjoy. My personal favorite that I found in here so far is the turkey, chili, and zucchini because honestly, considering I sit at my desk all day, it's good for me to have something lighter. I know that I'm obviously having to save this here as an ad, but genuinely, Factor actually saved my life these past 2 months, and I genuinely think that it could help you as well. So go to factor75.com and use code STAKUYI50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your second. Do it, because honestly, this is actually really good.
He went up the Meghna River to Sylhet, and there he went to find a famous holy man who reportedly could perform miracles and foretell the future. Supposedly, this guy, according to the story of what he says, is that he was 150 years old, which is very likely not true, but that's one of the stories that, they had here. According to Ibn Battuta, one day the old holy man would tell his surprised disciples that a traveler from North Africa was about to arrive and that they had to go out to meet him. The disciples went out and discovered that Ibn Battuta was on his way, 2 days away. Ibn Battuta would then stay there for 3 days and would share the stories of his travels with the holy man, and from there, continue on. Back in Chittagong, he would catch a Chinese junk and would then go to Samudra on the island of Sumatra. This, at this point, is the furthest reaches of Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, the cultural brotherhood that he had been using to travel and have safe. Okay, I try to say the word safe passage, but considering literally everything that we have been saying, none of this has really been safe. Still, though, this is where he would have the most support, and at this point, it was the furthest reaches in which everything was actually ruled by a Muslim ruler. Here he would stay for about 2 weeks in a wooden walled town as a guest of the Sultan, and the Sultan would then provide him with supplies and send Ibn Battuta on his way on his own junks to China. For about 40 days, Ibn Battuta would sail. And he's very vague about stopping in 2 different places, but at last he would arrive in the busy seaport of Guangzhou on the coast of Fujian province. And he finally arrived in China.
Honestly, why did he insist on going to China at that point?
He was a traveler. It's what he wanted to do. Do you want to know what the most disappointing parts about this entire thing is?
Does he hate it?
Yeah. Yeah, he does. In fact, this is a point in which I was trying to find as much info on this whole thing as I could, and there's not much because the man ends up being so sour about everything that he encounters in China, being so foreign and anti, for his own proclivities, like for Islam, that he basically refuses to leave his room the entire time he's there.
He's the type of traveler who goes to another country and gets so mad that they do things differently.
Yeah.
In
because at least in the
another
previous places that he
country?
went to, there was a very large Muslim presence. So it was something that it was, or not even presence, they ruled. They were the ruling class. So they could he had access to pretty much everything and he felt way more comfortable. And he did admire a lot of the things that he saw. He would observe that, quote, silk is used for clothing even by poor monks and beggars, and that porcelain was of the finest of all makes of pottery. Even the poultry amazed him, because he would say that the hens in China are bigger than the geese of our own country. He thought it was amazing. but he experienced major culture shock. He didn't like being in the place. He found it very difficult to understand or appreciate. And so much of this initial visit, he would stay inside of the places where he would stay, only venturing out when it was absolutely necessary. Because China was not a Muslim country, and the differences that he found and encountered oftentimes deeply offended him. As he would say about it, quote, "The Chinese themselves are infidels who worship idols and burn the dead like Hindus. They eat the flesh of swine and dogs and sell it in their markets." And that was something that he greatly despised. He would describe a trip on the Grand Canal to Beijing, the capital of Mongol China, but his description about this is so vague that most historians believe that he didn't actually make the trip. His book about his travels was, again, as we talked about, more of a travelogue of Islamic world, so it's very possible that he didn't actually go, and the description that he gave of the city was something that was just combined from the writings of other people and hearsay and other stuff and just put into it. Again, this was not an uncommon practice among traveler writers at the time. Like, that was a very normal thing for Islamic travel. Ibn Battuta would report meeting a rich Muslim trader who lived in Hangzhou, which may have been the largest city of the world at the time during the 14th century. He would tell of staying with an Egyptian Muslim for a few weeks, and there he would enjoy banquets, canal rides, and magic shows. In Fuzhou, he would meet with someone who he met with someone who he had met when he was passing through India, and this man, who was initially just a traveler, was now very rich, who reportedly owned about 50 white slaves and as many slave girls, and presented me with 2 of each, along with many other gifts. When Ibn Battuta would get back to Guangzhou, he would find a junk that was belonging to the Sultan of Samudra that was ready to go back. So, without further ado, he got on board and went to return home. In 3 years, he was going to be walking the streets of his hometown in Tangier, in Morocco, and describing his adventures throughout all of the world of Islam and beyond. His trip, this was one of those frustrating things. And this is why I was able to actually do this in 3 parts rather than more, because there really wasn't much to go off of. The winter monsoons would carry his sailing junk south from China. He'd return to Samudra on the island of Sumatra, where he would stay again with the Sultan, and this time it was for a few weeks. And from there, he would continue on to Ceylon, India, and from then on up to Calcutta. There, he thought about going back to Muhammad Tughlaq, because, money and safety, and at least he knows that. But he thought, I'm not sure if he's going to be very merciful. So fear of what Muhammad could do to him made him want to continue on with his journey. So when Ibn Battuta returned to India, though, Muhammad Tughlaq had already gone out battling more rebels in the north. There, he would end up dying of illness in 1351. And it was only a couple of years after Ibn Battuta had passed through India on his way back home. He wouldn't really last all that much longer. The Delhi Sultanate was reduced to a small northern state, while the south was nothing more than a patchwork of small Muslim and Hindu kingdoms battling with one another. The grand empire of the Delhi Sultanate, that would not last. It was, remember when we said in there, he was a very powerful, he was a very enlightened ruler, but he was also extremely paranoid and very brutal. He pissed off so many people that he was facing constant rebellions, and immediately upon his death, his empire was going to essentially disintegrate around him. So instead of staying in India, Ibn Battuta would decide to go on another Hajj to Mecca, and so he caught the monsoon winds that were heading westward back across the Indian Ocean. He would sail for 28 days, and he would arrive at Zafar on the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and with changes in the wind of the early summer monsoons, he would sail north through the Persian Gulf. He would arrive at Hormuz City, and he would find the elderly Arab ruler was there at war with 2 of his nephews for control of the territory. These ports were very important for trade, and the war had caused much destruction and famine. Once again, he was narrowly avoiding conflicts as he was arriving. So, he would leave. He would continue quickly through Persia, and he was very surprised at this point that once mighty Ilkhan Empire, the one that he was so amazed by when he went. Because remember, he traveled with the Khan in style. He had been there only 11 years before. But the Sultan had died, apparently poisoned by one of his wives. And then Mongol and Turkish generals challenged each other for control, And the result of that was that the entire country was torn apart into small military states that were constantly at war with one another.
Why would the Sultan's wife poison him? Because the wives couldn't rule, right?
I don't know whether it was out of jealousy for one of the other wives. Okay, here's one of the things that also reportedly has happened for a number of things. In harems, let's say that one of them has a son, right? And that son is set to take everything over. You may not like your husband, but you want your child to rule, and you can effectively rule the everything as a regent or puppet or have power and influence. This was a problem that happened in a number of cases in the Ottoman court. So it is possible that, you could have a scenario where a wife would poison their husband in an effort to utilize their child as a political tool. You could have had that. I'm just speaking not randomly. What's the word? I'm just
assuming.
I'm just assuming. Yeah, I'm just assuming at that point. You really don't know. So Ibn Battuta would go and return to Baghdad, and from there he would cross over to the Syrian desert on the camel route. And at last, he arrived in Damascus in the winter of 1348, the beautiful city that he had gone to so many years earlier. There he heard from caravan traders that his father had actually died 15 years earlier.
He was gone for that long.
He would travel in the end for 29 years. So yeah, his father had not lasted all that much longer into his journey. Ibn Battuta's account is very engaging in many different ways, but there is one very significant part of this that we have to talk about, and that is that his trip coincided with a major event in the Middle East and Europe. Something that we talked about that the Japanese used as a war crime in your episode, Gabby.
The plague?
The plague. The Black Death. The Black Death was spreading at the exact moment that he was coming. He was following, or the Black Death was following the exact routes that he was taking back home. It was following all the same trade routes. It was spreading from Central Asia to the Mediterranean and into Europe and North Africa. And so as Ibn Battuta was riding through Syria, this terrible disease was ripping the world apart. This was the Black Death. He first tried to outrun it, but every city that he went to was in the middle of a terrible outbreak. In Damascus, the death toll was approximately 2,000 people a day. The business of the city had come to a complete halt. The people were begging for God to stop the plague. But it wasn't happening. Still, even with the threat of the plague, Ibn Battuta would continue on to Palestine, and from there over to Cairo, where the toll was still rising. He would tell us that the death toll would reach 24,000 a day in Cairo. And from there, he would go up the Nile, where the plague had not yet started. Crossing the Red Sea, he would arrive at Jeddah, and from there continue on to Mecca. He would stay in Mecca for more than 4 months, and the plague ravaged it too. Because as you can imagine, with so many people trying to go there on pilgrimage and to pray for salvation, do you know what that's going to do?
Bring the plague.
It's going to bring the plague. Exactly. So with all the death around him, perhaps he felt the need to go home. He was 45 years old by this point, and he had been gone for 24 years. So he went back west and started to head back towards Morocco. He left Egypt on a small ship and he went to Tunisia, and from there he traveled overland. Made a brief trip to the Christian lands of Sardinia, but he heard rumors that the people there were pirates who would hold him for ransom, so he immediately left. After 10 days at sea, he had arrived at Tunis, and from there he went overland to Morocco. Here he would learn that his mother had died only a couple months earlier. And had she heard rumors that he was coming home? He doesn't know. All he knows is that he would miss the passing of his mother. He would arrive in his family's home of Tangier, and he would visit his mother's grave. There he would meet with his friends, his family, and he would share his tales of his travels to all the different parts of the world of Islam. But guess what?
What?
He wasn't done. He was still restless. He still wanted to do more. After everything that he'd experienced, after the Black Death, after all of that, he still wanted to go. So, after a few days, he decided to go to the nearby harbor city of Ceuta. And there, he was already thinking about making another trip. At the time of his return to Morocco, Al-Andalus, which is Andalusia or Muslim Spain, this was something that was being threatened by several Christian rulers. Because remember, this is the time of the Reconquista. It is the crusade to take back Spain from the forces of Islam. And so Ibn Battuta heard reports about the army of Alfonso XI of Castile, who might try to attack the fortress, not like the fortress, but like Gibraltar, that southernmost point that is one of these strong points that actually holds. It is the only port in the south that was still in control, or that was still in Muslim hands. If the Muslims lost that, they would have no way to properly reinforce the region. Everything would be under the control of the Christians. So Ibn Battuta heard about a Moroccan army of volunteers that was supposed to go over and defend Gibraltar. He had taken up arms a couple times over the course of his career and traveling, so he thought, okay, I can go myself. He felt very strongly about this war with the Christians, and he wanted to be able to help. So he set off by boat with a small group of passionate warriors that would go to Gibraltar in April of 1350. But by the time that he arrived, the danger had already passed. As it turns out, the Black Death kind of did their job for him. It had taken King Alfonso and many of the soldiers on both sides to the point that they couldn't actually fight anymore. They were simply too weak. The Strait of Gibraltar would remain under Muslim control for another 112 years. But he would decide to continue on into Al-Andalus, not as a soldier, but as a tourist. Now across the strait, he and his party would meet up with 12 other travelers, and he wanted to join them, but he held back with his original group. The 12 travelers that he had went on ahead, and later he would learn that the 12 had been attacked. One of them murdered, one of them escaped, and another had been taken prisoner to be held for ransom. He thanked God that he had been delivered from these pirates, and after that would spend the night in a castle, and the next day an officer would then escort the travelers safely on to the city of Malaga. From Malaga, he would continue on to the mountains, he would pass through Alhama, and on to Granada. Ibn Battuta would manage to see Granada in the reign of Yusuf I. Now, he may not have met the Sultan himself because of the ruler being very ill, but apparently the Sultan's mother was very nice and sent him a big purse of gold coins. So that's something, very nice. He spent time resting in the Sufi lodges and visiting the Muslim leaders, and in the home of one of these, he met a 20-year-old person by the name of Ibn Juzay.
28-year-old.
28-year-old. This guy was a poet, he was a writer of history, of law, and he was fascinated with the story of Ibn Battuta's travels, and he began to write down a bunch of the stuff here while he was there. Eventually, this is actually the guy who would end up being the person that would write down his full story. This would be the co-author that would go and create the record of his travels. So at the end of 1350, he goes and returns to Morocco. He had traveled through much of the Islamic world, but he had never really seen much of his homeland, of Morocco itself. So over the next several months, he was a traveler again. He went down the Atlantic coast to Asila, he visited Saleh, and then he rode south across the coastal plains to Marrakesh, a capital of the earlier sultans. He was saddened that this once great city was great no longer. The Black Death and the movement of its people had forced everything into the new capital, Fez, and it had left this ancient capital empty, with many of its fine buildings becoming dilapidated. Even worse than Baghdad had been after the Mongol invasion, he would say. So after this, he returns to Fez in the fall of 1351, and Morocco is at peace. The Sultan was planning the construction of a great college, and it would be a good time to settle down, to study, or become a judge, or a teacher. But, there's always a but.
Always.
He wasn't done, because there was one big place, technically speaking, within the world of Islam, that he had not yet gone to. There was a king he had not yet met. Mansa Suleiman, the Emperor of Mali, who, interestingly enough, we actually just had talked about before here when it came to the patron exclusive episode that we just did on Mansa Musa. So he planned his next trip southward across the Sahara Desert to the capital of Mali, 1,500 miles away.
He just can't stay home.
No, he literally cannot. So when Ibn Battuta had visited Cairo back in 1326, he undoubtedly had heard about Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, from 1307 to 1332, because Musa had passed through the city only 2 years earlier.
Oh, it was that close.
It was that close, making his pilgrimage to Mecca with thousands of slaves and soldiers, with wives and officials, and 100 camels, each of which was carrying hundreds of pounds of gold. So a trip to Mali, like all other trips, would be made easier because of the established trade routes that was controlled by Muslims. The rulers and many businessmen in Mali had already converted to Islam a generation before, and Muslim traders had come to live in Mali's business centers. So Ibn Battuta could not resist one final trip before he went and settled down. So he sets out from Fez in the autumn of 1351, and he crosses the Atlas Mountains. After traveling for 8 or 9 days, he arrives at a town called Silchmasa. Sigilmasa. Oh my God, I cannot speak. On the oasis of Tefilat. And this was the last outpost before crossing the vast Sahara Desert. Here he would spend 4 months waiting for winter season when the great caravans would cross the desert. Because, you don't want to go when it's absolutely hottest. And it was here that he would buy camels of his own while staying with Muslims who offered him hospitality. And so it was then that he would set out across the Sahara for Wilata in a camel caravan in February of 1352. They would travel in the early morning and the late afternoon, and they would rest under awnings to avoid the scorching midday heat. 25 days later, the caravan would reach the settlement of Takaza, the main salt mining center of the Western Sahara. Here, workers would load massive slabs of salt, which was in great demand in Mali. Takaza was a desolate place, though, as he would describe it, quote, "This is a village with nothing good about it."
Rude.
Oh, yeah, no, you're going to see the worst of his judgments for everything specifically has to do with Mali. I left out like 80% of the things that he said about this because I didn't want to sour things too much, but he was very judgmental of Mali and its people.
Why?
He definitely regarded them as inferior culturally, and also especially, remember, he's been given lavish gifts everywhere that he has gone. Gold, silk, horses, like just everything you can imagine. They don't exactly do that for him down in Mali. They give him gifts, sure. They give him welcome gifts, but we're going to talk about it in a second. One of the things that he was given as gift was literally a pot of yogurt.
Why?
Because that would be a gift that you would have given down there. Culturally, it's what you would have done.
Okay.
So he was very insulted by a lot of things that he was given. We're going to be getting into this. So the caravan would stay in Tagaza for 10 days, where he would stay in a house that apparently was entirely built of salt. Because remember, they're literally mining massive slabs of salt. So except for the roof, which was made out of camel skin, literally every single thing was made of salt. The water that was there, because, they have a little well and everything that we get water from, this was apparently really salty too. And the food had to be brought in from the outside because there was literally no way that they could get anything there. It was a deeply unpleasant experience for him. Then began the most dangerous part of the journey. Almost 500 miles of sand where only one water place would exist. Fortunately, there had been some rainfall that year, so there was some scattered vegetation and occasionally even pools of water for the camels. And the travelers would drink water from goatskin bags. Ibn Battuta was worried about running out of water, about his guides losing their way, and about falling prey to, quote, the demons who haunt those wastes.
This really is not the guy that should be traveling.
No, not in this scenario, especially since he's much older by this time. But in the end of April, they would arrive in Wilata, on the edge of the desert, a sweltering little town made of mud brick houses that was next to barren hills and with a few palm trees. Ibn Battuta would regret coming at all to this town because he had been treated so much better in other parts of the Islamic world. He resented the governor who offered the visitors a bowl of millet with a little honey and yogurt as a welcoming meal. And this is, I have quotes that directly come from the things that he says, and I'm going to say this to anyone who is listening right now. If you are offended by these things, yeah, you probably should be. He was very judgmental of people in general, and when he went to Mali, he looked down pretty heavily upon the people of this region, saying, and I quote, "Was it to this that black man invited us? They said yes. Yes, for them, this is a great banquet. Then I knew for certain that no good was to be expected from them, and I wished to depart." Like that is a direct quote that comes from him. It's just like, these people they cannot do anything.
At least they offered him food.
I know, right? Like, here he has been traveling through the desert for all this time. No, like fresh food, no fresh anything. And you get to this place that is clearly on the edge of this desert where everything is way more difficult. And the governor goes and gives them supplies when they very clearly do not have much there that they can do. You'd be freaking grateful, man. Like, what the hell? So he stays in Walata for several weeks, but as happened with other places in the journey, he takes very deep offense at local customs. After all, he must have thought that he was a special visitor that should be pampered. And even more offensive were the local customs that Ibn Battuta thought were not appropriate at all for good Muslims. As an example, he expected that the sexes were supposed to be separate in Islamic society. That was the norm. On one occasion, he entered into a qadi, a judge's house, only to find a young and beautiful woman there to greet him. She was the judge's friend. Now, he considered her presence there highly inappropriate. On another occasion, Ibn Battuta would call another scholar and would find the man's wife chatting with the strange man in the courtyard. Ibn Battuta would express his disapproval, and the man would answer, quote, "The association of women with men is agreeable to us, and a part of good manners, to which no suspicion attaches. They are not like the women of your country." Like literally, just the wife of a guy is just chatting with someone, just having a conversation. It's like, a woman talking with a stranger? She is a cheating harlot, clearly.
I just feel like he had the expectation of everyone being like him.
Oh, he absolutely did, especially considering that he was going to, remember that we used that phrase, Dar al-Islam, the world of Islam, like everything under the Islamic umbrella. So to him, as a judge of Sharia law, that this means that he was the rightful authority and that people should be adhering to his interpretation of how things should be done. Absolutely. He, again, very judgmental. Needless to say, Ibn Battuta considered local customs to be inferior to his own. And this is not the first time that Ibn Battuta would take issue with the behavior of women. He had that kind of judgment pretty much everywhere it is that he went. So the travelers would go southwards, away from the desert, and into the Sahel. This is the arid country between the sandy desert in the north and the grassy savanna to the south. And it's actually the region in which I have made a bunch of YouTube videos about, talking about the coup belt, so to speak. It's very interesting for what's going on there with modern politics. Along the way, he would offer glass beads, pieces of salt, all in return for millet, rice, chicken, and other local foods. And after 2 more weeks on the road, he would arrive at the seat of the government, a small town with several palaces for Mansa Suleiman, the younger brother of Mansa Musa, who had died. Now, Ibn Battuta must have wanted to see the ruler quickly, but 10 days after his arrival, he reported that he became seriously ill, apparently after eating some undercooked yams. One of his traveling companions died from that exact food. So Ibn Battuta would remain ill for 2 months, and after he finally recovered, he went on to observe a public ceremony, an audience with the Sultan Mansa Suleiman. After meeting with the ruler, he was given a small gift of 3 loaves of bread and a piece of beef that was fried in shea butter, and a gourd that was containing yogurt. This was, again, horribly insulting to Battuta, and he made it very clear to the ruler that, hey, buddy, I am very well traveled. I have met and dined with kings. I have done all of these great things and traveled to many places, and you will respect me as such. And if I go to these kings and I have conversations with them, what will I say about the Empire of Mali and how they treated me?
What the heck?
Yeah, exactly. So the response to that was that the ruler then went and gave him just like a bag of gold, basically. Just to shut the guy up at that point, because he was complaining. And they also gave him a house to stay in. In the end, like, he went and saw a bunch of stuff, or some stuff while I was there, but really he was disappointed with the whole thing. He would stay for 8 months, and he would finish off the trip with very mixed feelings before heading home. His return journey was even more difficult. He had brought a riding camel and another to carry his supplies, but in the desert heat, one of the camels died. Other travelers offered to help carry his supplies, but further on, he got sick again. He would recover in a small town called Takata, and here he would receive a message from the Sultan of Morocco that commanded him to return to Fez immediately. They would leave Takata on September 11th, 1353, in the company of a large caravan that was carrying 600 black female slaves to Morocco, and these were slaves that would be able to be sold on later as, domestic housemaids, concubines, or servants in the royal court. A gift, so to speak. The caravan would go northward for 18 days through the wilderness, and it would pass through the land of the veiled Berber nomads, whom Ibn Battuta would call good for nothing. We encountered one of their chief men who held up the caravan until we paid an impost of cloth and other things. So yeah, basically they got robbed again. They continued on and stopped at Siljmasa, where they would stay another 2 weeks, and then he went over the high Atlas Mountains in the dead of winter, saying, "I have seen difficult roads and much snow in other parts of the world, but I have never seen a road more difficult than that." At last, finally, he arrived at the capital of Fez, the city that was the center of the intellectual universe west of Cairo. It was 1354. And this time, finally, I know for anyone listening, this time, he was home for good. After Ibn Battuta would return to Fez in 1354, the Sultan of Morocco would listen to his reports on Mali. He would also listen to his stories and other adventures, and he ordered him to specifically stay in Fez. He wanted these stories to be written down for the sake of his own amusement and his family. So the Sultan went and hired a young writer, Ibn Juzay, that young man that he had met in Granada 3 years earlier, and so he began retelling his adventures that had begun 29 years earlier. He would weave his observations and hearsay, history, and all the varying different odds and ends and all the different crap just into one big story. Other elements would be combined. Ibn Juzay would add in poetry to fill other gaps. He would borrow the writings of other people who had gone on to visit Mecca, Medina, and Damascus when the descriptions just weren't enough. And that really makes a lot of the points of Ibn Battuta's travels hard to actually gauge the accuracy of. I warned at the very beginning of this whole series that we were doing that you need to take every single thing that we are saying here with a grain of salt, because everything is happening 29 years later at a point in which no notes were taken, nothing was written down, and not to mention, the writing wasn't even being done by Ibn Battuta. It was being done by another guy who took his oral story and combined it with other people's words to craft something. But that doesn't really matter. In the end, maybe Ibn Battuta did exaggerate his own importance to people he met. Many people would go and call him a liar, but many people would also support him as well. Will we ever actually know the truth of his journeys? No, we definitely won't. But, and whether this is fortunate or unfortunate, his story, the descriptions that he gives, all of these things, these are some of the only descriptions that we have of some of these places in the world at this time. That's it. Him as a source. Which is fascinating. At least in my opinion, in the end. And that, my friends, is the story of Ibn Battuta. I hope that you all enjoyed listening to this episode. I hope that you all enjoyed listening to the series. It has taken a long time to create, and I apologize, but I really hope that in the end you all were able to learn something fascinating. I really did like to cover more parts of the world, and I'm very glad that we were able to go into such an extensive story. Without further ado, we're going to end things here, and I ask that you all check out the links in the description here of the podcast, or if you're listening or watching to this on YouTube, check out the links there, whether it's for